the hour, just go ahead and go. Okay.
Right. Okay, welcome everyone to the second plenary panel at FACT 2021. The title of this panel is Causality, Fairness, and Its Limitations. For those of you who are using closed caption, you should be able to click on the accessibility link below. If you need to customize those closed caption, you'll need to have a separate window open, but there will be basic closed captioning embedded in the live stream. So if you don't need to customize, you can just use the live stream. So I'm excited to welcome three fantastic panelists who are going to talk to us about causality and the implications that it has for the AI fairness discourse and field. I'll let them introduce themselves, but we're going to dig into some pretty meaty subject matter. And I, for one, am not an expert in causality. So if there's any clarifying questions you want to ask in Slido, I probably share those questions, and I'm happy to ask the panelists to sort of dumb it down for us. But I'll have you all introduce yourselves. And if we can start with you, Kosuke, if you could share your name, your institution, and from a disciplinary perspective, sort of how you come to the conversation of causality, and we'll let each of you do that so we can have a sense of sort of where you're oriented in the debate.
Okay, well, thanks for putting this together. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. My name is Kosuke Mai. I'm a professor in both government department and statistics department at Harvard. So I'm a sort of statistician, but also social scientist. And as a social scientist, I've been interested in estimating the causal effects of different program evaluation interventions. So the causality is a very natural part of it. And I'm really interested in discussing how causal inference connects to fairness and AI and all that.
Perfect, thank you. Ricardo? And you are muted.
Yeah. Hello, I'm Ricardo. I'm a professor at the Department of Statistical Science at University College London. And I come more from a machine learning perspective, so I have lots of interest in how causal inference and machine learning interact. I came into the field of fairness via my colleagues at the Alan Turing Institute, which is another big data science center in the UK. So we have all these issues about algorithmic fairness, particularly in situations like prediction problems, prediction models that take place for automated decision making. How to make sure they don't incur some unfair decisions, or try to mitigate possible sources of biases, and which roles causal inference might play on that is where I come from.
That's great, thank you. And Isa?
Hi, my name is Isa Kohler-Hausman. I'm a professor at the Yale Law School and also by courtesy in the sociology department. I'm interested in this because social sciences have long debated and thought about the question of what it means when we make causal claims in general, and specifically about causal claims about social categories. And I'm also interested in this because causal concepts seem to also play a significant role in legal doctrines. And I've been interested in exploring what that could possibly mean, and if it's a helpful or sensical, if it's an expansive or limiting way to approach anti-discrimination law and equal protection.
Fantastic, thank you. And I think we're already starting to see where you all are going to come at this from slightly different fields and sort of ways of thinking about these issues. So I wanted to sort of, given we're all at a sort of AI fairness conference, say a little bit about sort of why is causality this new, or getting this new emergence within this field and becoming such a hot topic, for lack of a better expression. I'd love to hear from you, to sort of thinking, why is it emerging within the AI fairness community, do you think, as a method, as a way of thinking, as a priority? And Kosuke, do you want to go? We can do the same, little go round. Yeah.
Yeah,
cool.
so I think for me, causality is very important in the field of fairness, precisely because I think these decisions that we're interested in, whether it's algorithmic or human decisions, affect people. So we really need to, like, the whole reason that we care about fairness is that because these decisions are affecting people maybe in a positive or sometimes negative ways, right? And that's how we want to take it into account for the impact that these algorithms have or AI has on the welfare and other aspects of human beings. So I think that naturally brings causality into the debate. We're not just predicting, we are assessing the impact of these AI and algorithms on humans.
And Ricardo, do you want to expand on that? Is there anything you'd add in terms of where it's useful, or sort of how it sort of enters this debate and conversation?
Yes, besides the very important point that there's a lot to be said about how causality is important for policymaking, one of the perspectives I work with is precisely in automated predictions. So if you have, as I mentioned, some classification problem, like say that is used for offering jobs or ranking candidates for a job application, you may want to think which types of inputs I should be using that I don't discriminate against possible candidates. And this is a bit tricky because there are all sorts of ways by which the things you measure may not be clearly understood in terms of bias towards particular groups. So it may be interesting in understanding to which extent some of the particular things you measure and use in these predictive algorithms may actually be proxies or maybe actually indirect ways by which we're discriminating people. So try to understand the cause-effect relationships between the variables that you're making using of. This helps to illuminate what's sensible or not.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Isa, do you want to sort of round us off?
Sure. Well, I was sort of hoping that the computer science people would say this part, because I don't know if I'm very qualified to do it. But as far as I understand your field, what I like to call the sort of Terminator 1 version of interest in causality, I'm sorry, in fairness and algorithms started with a bunch of observational or statistical definitions of fairness. And then there was some dissatisfaction with that because those observational or statistical definitions of fairness can be observationally equivalent with a bunch of different underlying mechanisms that actually produced those. There's multiple and mutually exclusive statistical or observational definitions. And so as far as I understand it, and please, you actual computer science people correct me if I'm misstating this, but what I then like to think of as the Terminator 2 version comes out and says like, well, what we need to do is actually ground claims of fairness in something about the world and not in something about numbers, which makes sense if you think about the idea that fairness or non-discrimination is a normative term, and it can't therefore represent something about a relationship that holds between numbers. It has to mean that it's a relation that holds between people in our world, right? Like Kosuke said. So as far as I understand this, we're here today to sort of talk about and debate one candidate for grounding the relation in our actual world, and that's in relations of causal dependence. And as far as I understand that view, the idea is something like this: an algorithm or prediction method is unfair or discriminatory just in case a protected feature, or my favorite, sensitive attribute causes the outcome in some way. But if we think about it, it can't just be the case that it's causal dependence alone that grounds that determination of unfairness or discrimination, because lots of things cause other things. And we have no reason to think that we need to rupture or block those causal dependencies. It can't just be that there's some random set of causes that are profane, that we've just declared certain features protected or sensitive in an arbitrary fashion. Rather, it has to be that there's something special about these categories. And I suppose what I want to argue, and I think that I have a unique perspective probably that might be a little at odds with some other people on the panel, and that if we think about it, these categories are not categories of features or traits. We don't have race or gender because people just share physical attributes. The way that we might have a category of people that are bunioned and not bunioned simply by virtue of the fact that they actually share protrusions on their feet. Rather, we have race and gender because there's categories of social relations, and that it's actually this particular relational positioning of economic, social, and cultural relations that people stand in relatively to each other that actually make those traits salient. So the traits aren't causes of disadvantage. Rather, the social arrangements are arrangements of advantage and disadvantage that by virtue of being arranged that way persistently over time and in many domains make certain traits salient. And so I actually think that when the problem that the Terminator 2 version faces in computer science is that many of these methods go about then declaring fairness a matter of holding everything else equal, except for just the trait, which I think is inconsistent with the view for why we care about the trait in the first place. So I have a lot more to say, but I'll kind of leave it at that.
No, that's great. And I want to give Kosuke and Ricardo a chance to respond to that, because I feel like you just brought up a couple of really rich areas. And I feel like it touches a little bit on, Kosuke, your point about policy, but I'm curious sort of hearing Issa's the way she's thinking about it. What comes to mind, or are there further things you want to push on?
Yeah, so this is extremely interesting and deep point. I think in my sort of own work, where maybe I'll talk a little bit more later, but where I'm looking at decision by judge and how the algorithmic recommendation can impact the judge decision and subsequently the behavior of the people. It's really important to put the whole study, I feel, that in the context of the entire society, right? So it's often sort of we focus on this part of the particular decision making or use of AI, and yet the whole reason that become problematic is there's all these background factors that shaping, how people in my application, how people are getting arrested. How do they arrive at this point where the judges are now making decisions based on the algorithmic recommendation, and sort of without sort of considering that part of the process, it's really hard to know what exactly mean to have a fair algorithm, and operationalize that and using certain statistical and machine learning algorithms. So I'm not really giving any answer, but I always feel that the data I observe is conditional on a lot of things that's happening before that, and we need to, at the minimum, we need to keep that in our perspective when analyzing the data, and then building the algorithm, because it's part of the society, right? And it's entirely possible that if you change a policy in the domain that you're working on, that could also have another consequence that in the part of the other part of the process that you may not observe. So yeah, I'm not really giving any solution to it, but I think that point is very important. It's part of the entire social, institutional environment that needs to be taken into account.
Yes, I'd also add. Sorry. So to build on Kosuke's point, I would also add, I mean, there are different ways in which people use causality in the context of fairness. At least the way I do it, the causal model is just one piece of the puzzle. It's just a one particular way of describing how things take place. It doesn't make any judgment calls what the value of these events are. So part of the idea, or at least my line of work, when you use causal methods for algorithmic fairness, is that judgment calls are also an input to the whole process. So you may say, this protected attribute causes this particular event, but I'm okay with that to use the measures of this event as part of a prediction or decision problem. So you may have, for example, age may cause me, I don't know, and age, of course, is difficult to define causal, but there's another point you can get to it later. You may think of age, in one sense, bringing about, I mean, less acuity in your vision. So it cannot be, let's say, a jet fighter because of that, and that's fine. You may judge that that's fine. And this judgment is external to the algorithm, is external to the causal model. It's part of your problem specification. So I don't think it's at odds to say, yes, the model, this description of how things take place cannot possibly tell us what's fair or not. And the other source of information that you must use is judgment calls of whether something is fair or not, which maybe you can refine by taking into account somebody's assumptions about the causal structure. But it's in one sense independent of it. It's something that comes as part of the problem specification along with the causal model. At least, I mean, I'm aware that in some cases people like to declare a universal law that says, oh, there is no direct effect on this, on that, then there is no discrimination. But I don't think that there's the mainstream way of doing that in my own little corner of causal modeling for algorithmic fairness.
So do you want to, jump in?
So it sounds like there's one thing that we all agree on, which is that a relation of causality alone, a claim of an appeal to those metaphysics can't ground a normative claim, right? And I guess I want to give a shout out to my two collaborators on this, which are Lily Hu and Robin Dembroff, one PhD student, that's Lily, in math and philosophy, and Robin, who's a philosopher. Because we've thought a ton about both these issues together. So, Hume taught us a long time ago that you can't get aught from is. So that should be sort of fairly straightforward. But the question is this form of modeling actually a helpful form of modeling for getting at the question? And so I want to keep pushing on that, because the counterfactual causal model, the potential outcomes framework, requires us to specify with some rigor what the treatment is, what the intervention is. And if you take my view, if you're essentially, I think, a constructivist about the categories, if you think traits don't cause things, social relations are actually the things that make those traits have any causal capacity whatsoever, right? Like, there's no inherent meaning to this. You have to live in a world where crosses have meaning, right? Crosses don't cause things, like a set of beliefs and background structures about religion and associating that symbol with things do. Then you have to ask, what are we doing exactly when we're imagining holding everything else constant except for that intervention? Because what it is to be in a social group, a salient one at least, is to be dissimilarly situated with respect to a whole host of important things. And so what the model should be doing, by my lights, to say I don't just have criticisms, I actually have proposals. I think what we should be doing is mapping out what it is to have groups of this kind, to see what constitutes the relevant differences. Because once we have a map of this, then we know if you hold constant something like saying that the person is Catholic, but you say they go to mosque or they go to temple, you're saying that they're dissimilarly situated with respect to the category. And that's the case with social groups like gender and race too. And so the question is, what the kinds of fairness that you want to see aren't, let's imagine that there's no differences and see if they're treated differently. The relevant question is, given that the social group is constituted by this whole collection of differences, what's a relation of equality? And that's a very, very different way of approaching this. Instead, what you ask, you want to say something like, given that the social groups of gender are constituted by dissimilar responsibilities and caretaking and whatever other sorts of social relations, what's a fair relation of equality? That's very different than saying, I'm going to hold constant number of hours spent with children at home, and only in those cases where they have the same number of hours had at home, if I see a dissimilar treatment, I'm going to call that discrimination.
That's really, yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I think it's just a really interesting also what happens when you're wrong. So in the case where you're essentially trying to protect against the continued mistreatment in a model by equalizing, if you're wrong, then the people that are historically and sort of socially discriminated against will experience that within the context of a digital system. But if you're trying to defend and sort of build out models that actually repair and think from that position, it's if you're wrong, you might provide sort of err on the side of providing more to someone who historically or situated in society is discriminated against. But that's super interesting. Ricardo or Kosuke, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, it's sort of curious about, like, I think Lisa is like bringing the really important point, and I sort of wanted to sort of contrast like two potentially different causal approaches to fairness. So one is, I think perhaps right now, like predominant way of thinking about this, which is I think part of the critique of Lisa's critique is that like this counterfactual fairness. The notion is that, you know, trying to sort of figure out whether there's any direct effect of the, say, race or gender on the outcome. So then the question becomes like, what does that mean to change the gender or change the race, or even how you define that type of counterfactual word? Like, what does it mean for me to be, say, Black, like I'm Asian? But like, what does thinking about that counterfactual mean? So I think there's real difficulty in that. You know, it's one thing to look at sort of binary, you know, the categorical variable that's being coded in the data, but how you define it, like what does it mean for me to be African American, and all that issues will come out, and how you connect that to the empirical analysis in the particular application is, I think, even more challenging. So I'd like to hear what Ricardo have to say on this. But the other way of thinking about causality is sort of the approach I've been taking is to think about like how the, say, use of AI affects the human decision. Because in many cases, including the application that I have, which is like a judicial decision, the algorithm doesn't make a decision. Like the humans actually make a final decision, and the algorithm make a recommendation is just a part of the information they receive. So that it's not so important whether the algorithm itself produces the fair, you know, whatever, however you define fair prediction or not, it doesn't really matter. If the algorithm is making the human decision in a more fair way, that's what we care about, because we care about the final decision that's being made. Even if algorithm is a super accurate and maybe super fair, if the human decided to only follow the algorithmic recommendation in some cases, but not others, you can introduce a discrimination. So human bias could interact with the algorithmic bias, and that could lead to the unexpected situation. So there, I think the causal effects are a little bit easier to define, because you're talking about what if the judge makes a different decision? What if the judge given $1,000 bail instead of 500, or maybe signature bond? So these counterfactuals and associated potential outcomes are, I think, a little bit easier to define because the judge's decision is well defined, as opposed to like thinking about the potential outcomes with respect to somebody's identity, like such as gender and race, which tend to be like a social constructs. And it comes with all the complicated issues that Issa is raising.
Yes, I would also add, what the main key problems here is the problem of measurement, right? You have all these traits, you have all these constructs, and sometimes it's not easy even to measure what they mean. And it'd be surprising how much of causal inference this notion of treatment is actually not that clear. I mean, you can make cases even in medical domains that the notion of treatment is not 100% unambiguous. There's interesting paper by Miguel Ardan where he asks this question: does water kill? I mean, it depends what you mean by define the event of taking water, right? So he's making all these different comparisons. Well, it just means take a glass of water, it will not kill you. It just means getting drowned in the ocean, that's different. If it means taking a glass of water from that famous pump from Broad Street in London in the mid-19th century, where that's where people started to think about germ theory. And there was cholera in that water. And these all these things all behind the same symbol of water. It's part of the scientists creating these models to make very clear what the measurements mean. And these measurements don't need to mean every possible aspect that symbol can take. I know sometimes people are not satisfied about the notion of racist perception, for example, that they think it's too limited, it doesn't capture all possible spectrum of what race might mean. But I think there's a valid way of thinking about problems in fairness that when you have these very complex constructs, very complex traits, you may not want to capture all possible aspects of it. It may be important and useful to consider situations, for instance, that perception in particular applications may be one particular way of looking at this facet of this trait that is useful for this particular claims that you have a fair process or not. But I take your point that this is not trivial, not at all. And it doesn't apply only to social science, it applies to medical science, it applies to all sorts of other domains, that there's always a degree of ambiguity in intervention. Even taking, say, spend extra hours with your kid at home to improve maybe their performance. Even that is not a very clear treatment. What does that mean? X continuous hours that he interacts with them in non-productive ways. There's always a degree of ambiguity left, but you shouldn't take this as an impediment that something useful can be modeled out of it.
So I want to respectfully disagree with my co-panelist on this issue, and because I want to distinguish two things, which is a commitment to events being causes on an interventionist philosophy, like a particular version of what causality, which is we're just thinking of events as causes. And so in this water example that you just gave, at least for as far as I understand from the example that you gave, the problem comes with actually asking about states of affairs as being causes and trying to back out what event itself brought about that state of affairs. And that's a conceptually different question from the one that I'm raising, which is what does it mean to talk about social categories? And I actually think there's something very particular to social categories that make this form of interventionist counterfactual causation something that can't be specified in like basically what I want to call a non-backtracking, because anytime you change a signal, the feature that you're signaling, and you take that signal to signal a category membership, it's going to necessarily it's going to entail changes to other things, because it's not the trait itself. The trait is simply a signal for category membership, and categories have this quality that you might call, philosophers sometimes call projectability, which is when you take someone to be a member of a category, you take a whole set of things to be true about them. And this is why I'm distinguishing bunions from something like religion or gender or race. If you signal that I have a bunion, you just think I have this physical feature on my foot. But if I wear a cross, or I wear a headscarf, or you take me to be female coded, or you take me to a particular race, what you're associating in your mind is like category membership. So now if I say I'm wearing a cross, but I go to mosque and temple, you just take me to be a non-conforming instance of the kind. It entails changes to the other things that you're holding constant. So it's not about, the question is not that can you not put some experiments forward that get at the concept, but the question is, what are you getting at with those? My point is simply, you're not isolating the treatment effect of race because you're suddenly doing this trade, which is you're interested in race because it's a social category, but then suddenly you're reducing it to just a physical feature. There's no such thing as just the treatment effect of a race or gender or crosses, because they're not bunions. They're not features. We don't have the categories because we collect people that share an intrinsic trait. We have the categories because we take people to be relationally distinct. Now, you can say that they're a non-normative instance, but this is why I think the entire question of why we're doing this, right? There's this thing that we say in the law, like when we're teaching equal protection, there's this famous phrase, which is the law and its majesty forbids the rich and poor from sleeping under the bridges, okay? So let's say you have a society that's stratified by poverty and richness. And the rich people wear purple velvet and the poor people wear tattered jeans. Now, if you say I hold everything else constant, and people with velvet and people with tattered jeans are no more likely to sleep under the bridge, it's just you've assumed away the question of whether or not that law is biased against poor people, because tattered jeans and velvet don't cause things. They're actually just indices of the relations that those people sat into each other. And so I just think that the question has to come back to describing the systematic ways that people are differing, and then asking what's fair given those differences.
So maybe I can try to sort of figure out if there's a way to go in the middle way. So so this idea of, the like the point Isa is making, which I think is very, very important, the race as a treatment or gender as a treatment, there's so many aspects of it. And so it's not even maybe well defined. And maybe one, I was just thinking that the one way to address this from like Ricardo's perspective, which is sort of counterfactual fairness, looking at whether there any direct effect of the race on the outcome, is to sort of nail down some of these mechanisms. Like if you change, what you wear, whether it's a cross or other things, if that causes certain reactions, like we try to figure out what that mechanisms are, and then try to, using some causal modeling, try to adjust for that. So we get at like maybe real sort of racial discrimination, maybe direct racial discrimination that you're trying to really capture. But that requires, I guess, us to understand all these different mechanisms that different race could affect, or maybe the different aspects of being Asian or being white.
But what are you trying to isolate? Like, what is the thing that you're trying to
I'm just
get
trying
at?
to think about if you try to sort of figure out like how. I guess Ricardo could speak, but if that type of sort of direct effect approach is trying to address this critique, it has to be decomposing the race into different aspects of that, and that has to come from some substantive theory or knowledge, and then how different aspects of the race are affecting and the decisions or the outcome of interest. And unless you unpack some of that, your critique will stand. But how to do that is I think application specific issues that needs to be dealt with, right?
Yeah, this is indeed application specific, right? As I was mentioning, this is everywhere. I mean, when people create indices, this is one way of simplifying what they're describing. It doesn't mean they actually think that this is the perfect way of doing this. It's a simplification, is to be able to say, in this context, this may be good enough, and they criticize that. But these indices, these summaries, can be useful if you understand what they correspond to. So when people say, oh, does obesity cause heart disease? And obesity, of course, is a very complex trait. It's composed of many other aspects of you. They want to quantify that with body mass index. And you think, okay, I'm really finding body mass index as something that I can fully control precisely. And how do I even do that, right? It could have a body mass index being affected by other ways that have nothing to do with health treatments. You could lose a leg, for example, an accident. This would change your body mass index. It doesn't mean that this is the particular change you have in mind when using that variable. So when people use sometimes these notions of this index or this particular summary causing this outcome, they must defend, of course, that there are ways or there's a particular set of possible ways by which you could change that factor without keeping the relationship of outcome roughly stable. But this is not something that comes from just defining that I'm going to use this index. I mean, behind these scenes, yes, as Issa rightly says, you have to think about what do we mean about keeping the other relationships stable. these indices are capturing something real. They're not capturing something out of nature, even if it's something related to social interactions. They do have causes of their own, is whether you can justify having changes to that which keep other relationships stable or not, that will operationalize what I mean by this trait causing that outcome.
The important thing I think to see about the social world is that the causal capacities of these signals are dependent upon the social relations. Like, I just think that that's the key that we have to see here. They're ontologically dependent. Like, I actually think that what many of these versions that I see trying to specify, talk about social categories and DAGs and potential outcomes are just making true ontological mistakes. They're dependent upon it. So I don't know what it means to sort of, for example, let's take my fictitious world where you have, the royals and the impoverished, and they wear velvet and they have certain cultural ways of being. And then they have their degraded cultural ways of being that are looked down upon as being worse than. The fact that their cultural ways of being, like signaling, listening to their type of faded gene music would signal something is dependent upon society being arranged that way. And so the point is, like, if we intervened on the social structure, that would make the meaning of the music different. That would make the meaning of the faded gene. And in fact, that's the entire point of anti-discrimination law, right? Like, the point of saying you have to hire women into positions of authority is to change the meaning of seeing someone that's signaled female. Is to no longer think that person just looks like a dummy or a caregiver. It's to actually reconstitute the social conditions that produce the meanings, right? And so I have a hard time understanding what exactly it means to portion out the causal capacities of these constitutive parts, because I actually think it's a non-modular causal system. Now, I think that if you reconstituted the system, right, it's like saying, like, if we reformulated the government, then people would have a different relationship to it. Yes, but I just have a hard time. To me, it's like saying, like, flour is responsible for 30% of this cake's deliciousness. Like, I just don't know what that means. And I don't know, like, this sort of like race is a bundle of sticks thing, like people love to cite that paper. And I don't know what that means. It just suggests that it's modular, that intervention to one component of it leaves untouched the other causal dependencies. And I think that's entirely wrong. I think what we want to do is model the dependencies between the causal system.
You're starting to answer a question, just quickly, real quick, the sort of top question that people are asking and sort of upvoting. I just shared it in the chat with you all, but is that the potential outcomes framework and more general RCT way of reasoning about causes was originally developed to reason about causes in a natural physical world, framing, medical trials, et cetera. How should the underlying theoretical underpinnings of the framework be altered for social categories? So I think you say you're basically saying it's not possible, I think, if I understand you correctly, but I'd love to sort of, if you could field that question, and then the others can also respond.
You guys start.
If you want to,
no, you guys start. I was just getting all passionate. I got to cool down.
Yeah. Okay, I can go. Okay. Yeah. So I think I see that difficulty. So I that's why I think I'm being in my application, like I've been sticking with not so much about the effect of the race, but how the effect of AI on human decisions and then how that impact different people differently. So there, the counterfactual is all about whether to, like in my experiment, this is a real world experiment we've been doing with the Jim Greiner, Harvard Law School, working with several counties in the US. We're basically showing like half the time the judge see the algorithmic recommendation, and then the other half the time they don't see the recommendation. And we are trying to see how that influences the judge's decision differently on, depending on the characteristics of RSTs. So this is a pre-trial release decision. And so there, I think the potential outcome approach is quite suited, but because you can literally see the case where the judge actually sees the recommendation and not see it. And then the question is, as a policymaker, should we continue to use this type of algorithmic recommendation or not? So you can also directly connect to the policy making. I think the difficulty with the attributes is, it raises all these difficulties of like, what do you mean to change your race or change your gender? And I was trying to sort of figure out a way, and I was thinking about trying to sort of block some partial effects that people have in mind. But I guess those needs to be exactly specified and what they are. And I think in most studies, that's not often done. It's just a category and it doesn't really, well specify the treatment. So I see that, the difficulty there in applying this potential outcomes framework to the attributes such as race and gender.
Yes, I think I understand a little bit better also what he says in mind. It's the difference between constitutive and causal relationships. I mean, of course, if you have an entity that is made of many constitutive parts of it, intervening one particular part of it may not be feasible or desirable or anything of that sort. I mean, when people talk about race, sometimes, as I said, is a summary, as an index, that may be completely inappropriate if you just reduce somebody to a particular category in a list that you find in a form. You may want to define an entity by several constitutive parts listed explicitly, right? But you don't reduce that to an index. You have to represent your entire treatment as one complex treatment, one complex exposure. You don't need to think about isolate one of them separate from the others, because it may be completely impossible, even ill defined. If you think about there are situations, for example, where you tell somebody, oh, your credit score is poor because you didn't spend enough time doing this particular training for that. You didn't spend enough time solving this other problem that you need to spend some time with. Maybe you say you need to do more of your job in that situation. You need to do more in terms of participating in a community, so it's something like this. And they may want to tell them, you spend this amount of hours here, this amount of hours there, when they don't adapt together because those don't have enough time to do everything. So we have a treatment that is just infeasible. It's not possible because it just violates physical constraints. Then, of course, this is not well defined as a whole. You need to specify the sub-parts of it that you're actually controlling. So I'm not sure if I'm being clear here, but sometimes I totally agree that you maybe want, if you reduce some particular category to some very vague summary, some very vague index, intervention like that is ill-defined because there are many ways of getting into that. So in that situation, you need to expand it if it's necessary for the particular relationship that you have in mind.
So Isa, someone asked a question that I feel like is a good follow-up for you to pick up on, which is essentially, so they're saying in practice, the individual differences in social contexts are hard to systematically measure, and looking at protected group membership might be a feasible compromise, which is, yeah, up for debate here. But the question is, what's your advice for practitioners regarding the dilemma? So sort of how would you encourage people to think about this that are in a position where they're sort of forced to navigate that potential compromise and these issues?
So really quickly, yes, Ricardo, I'm exactly the same. In fact, I've read an entire paper saying that we misunderstand narrow counterfactual causal explanations for what are essentially constitutive explanations in social categories. And I think that's what we're doing. And so if that's the case, then something like RCTs or RTCs, as I like to call them, because I'm a little dyslexic, which is random trials, comma, with control, is what you can do is like, yeah, you can do an audit study, you can do this thing, but you just, if once you get the theory right, then you know what you're doing, right? So I wrote a whole paper about this audit studies things, and my co-author Lily has thought a ton about this. You can look for some of her work on this. But like, once you think that to hold someone in the category of, let's say, male and female is actually to think that they stand in a relation with respect to caregiving work. If you send two resumes, one is male, one is female, and they both have a 5-year gap, right? You're not holding everything else constant just because you've dittoed the resumes, right? You're saying the male, the Greg resume, stands in a non-normative relationship with respect to caregiving, and the female stands in a normative. So once you know that, then you can still say, I want to count this as evidence of discrimination, but it just stands on your prior norm of theory that people are owed something by virtue of the differences that people stand. And I think this does answer the question, which is the audience question is, okay, what do practitioners do? What you do is you kind of use your armchair anthropologist, your armchair sociologist, and you can use some of this fancy data stuff you guys are so good at to actually map the systematic differences, right? And then the question is like, okay, it turns out that being an X versus a P is a matter of standing relationally, systematically different in all these domains. And then your question is, okay, what, like theoretically, what does this mean what I'm doing, right? So it's basically a call to be like, what the hell do these X's and Y's mean? Like, what do they reference, right? What do they correspond to in the world? And remember, the whole point of this Terminator 1 to Terminator 2 turn was that we thought, hey, it has to be something in the social world that makes it the case that things are fair and not fair. It's not something about numbers. And so we have to look back to that to make that. And again, I also understand that's the entire point of AI, right? Like, I've watched Westworld. Like, you want to make some smart computers, they don't need to just understand cause relations, right? Like Judea Pearl is this whole thing. Like, if you want computers to be smart, they have to understand cause and effect. You're gonna have some dumb motherfucking computers if they don't understand categories. If they don't think categorically, if they don't understand like, oh, this is a restaurant, I shouldn't floss my teeth. I only do that in something that's a bathroom. Like rude in restaurant, not rude in bathroom. Like that, if the computer doesn't have categories you know, again, like we're being dumb computers if we're not thinking about our categories.
So I'll pick up on the sort of, if we're using fancy data stuff, what should we be thinking about aside from recognizing that fancy data stuff is situated in a world? But Ricardo or Kosuke, do you have anything you want to either answer this person's question or reflect on Isa's comments?
I'm curious to know what Isa just said. Seems to be completely consistent with what Ricardo said, and I'm not sure if that's right. But you say, or maybe you won't say, but maybe I'm just saying. So I'm not putting something putting you in the spot. But like it seems like you're just saying, okay, if the resume experiment, if the discrimination against gender is because of this gap, then make sure that's being measured. That's part of the experiment. Is that the solution? Like, what would you do in practice? Like, we all know gender, race is complicated. We all know we can never measure it perfectly. And we have some theories from social sciences, how these discriminations occur, like how people perceptions, leads to the bias. We don't know everything. We know some pathways. Maybe this like gap, few years of gap is interpreted as something differently between the male and female applicants. We have all these theories or conjectures, and if you're saying like in practice, if you want to do better, you should be measuring all this. You should think about these factors, and you should be measuring this, or use them as a part of the experiment or part of the study, whether it's observational or experimental. And that seems completely consistent with what Ricardo might suggest you do. I'm not sure if that's like.
Yes, if I may feedback on that. So one of the things I had in mind is, for example, was the notion that sometimes fairness judgments come from judgments about control, that sometimes don't have control what happens to you, or sometimes there are events that happen to you because of a category. So for example, you have a model that tries to do job scoring for offering positions in a company, and this model uses whether they have been arrested or not in the past. And one great way of creating equality in the world, right, is having draconian laws that apply different to different groups. So it may be the case that you got arrested, yet somebody else was in conditions that would not happen to somebody else for a different group. And they may think, okay, this information of you being arrested, maybe that's not fair to be used because different people will have different risks of being arrested based on their social category. And that's a judgment call that doesn't come from an algorithm. It doesn't come from the causal model either. The causal model might say something about a chain of events. It says absolutely nothing whether the information that is there is discriminatory or not. It just tells you, well, if being arrested is something that maybe is unfair to be used in a judgment on a prediction about getting a job offer or not, I might try to explain that via this notion that, well, the person, that group did not have full control on that event. And that's where the causal model will play a role, this notion of control. And this will inform me saying, well, I may not use, I don't feel comfortable in using that measurement directly. And that's a judgment call. And this is how I see the interplay between actually knowledge on values, on assessments of fairness, and just a cold and not a fully complete description of reality that comes from causal model. These two things work together when I'm making a judgment on what, for example, I should use or not in a model for job ranking.
Well, so I think so that we agree on certain things. Well, I also just want to say that it's not just like when we talk about problems of measurement, it implies that we agree on the ontology and that there's epistemic problems with getting to it. And I'm actually kind of pushing on what the thing is, on what our concepts are. And so I think, why I said before, I agree, Ricardo, that like on my position, what it is to have social categories is to have some complexly constituted by virtue of a series of relations, right? And so therefore that's like a concept, not necessarily a measurement issue. But at any time we do something like this, what we're really doing is saying, given that this is the set of inequalities that these groups sit in, what's a fair treatment, right? So the only thing that I would say is that, your example, as long as it's not limited to things that by virtue of the social relations, people just don't have control over. So your example of arrest is a good one, but let's think about Judea Pearl's favorite example that it seems like all computer scientists love to use, right? The Berkeley study, right? Once we condition on, department that people apply to, there's no direct effect of sex. So on admissions to graduate school. So here's something where to have a gendered society just is to have a society where people actually imbue different human children with preferences based on the sex, like reproductive features that they see in little babies. So they're like, oh, like female reproductive features, you're going to be into nursing and art, male reproductive features. So it's actually like a preference formation from the ground up. And so that's why the whole question has to be like, let's describe what it is to have stratification of this type. And if one way that it is actually like fully, like imbuing preference formation from babyhood, which is a term of art, which means when you're a baby, onward, like then that has to be, the question is, are we going to define discrimination or unfairness, right? I mean, I think sometimes discrimination people unfairly think like malign intent. Let's just say like unfairness. It may even control things that people, do have control over, right? Like, it's just, the point is it's a normative debate. It's a normative debate about what you want to hold constant, but that has to be based on a description of what it is to have a system like.
If I'm not mistaken, my memory might be failing me. I think the original paper by Bickel, where he analyzes this case against Berkeley, I think he mentions at some point, by the way, this assumes that the choice of major applying to, this is also not considered itself an unfair process, because you have all these cultural influences on the choice of major apply to. I think they actually mentioned that explicitly in that paper, which is something we overlook a lot, right? Which is very good that bring this up here. We overlook this a lot when you think about, oh, it's just a direct fact, it disappears. No, it's not only about that. It's the entire process that happens.
So Issa, just a quick follow-up on that. I mean, if it's turtles all the way down, how should practitioners think about the choices that they're making in that?
Well, I mean, one reason I've been on this, this thinking that this really matters is because this isn't just computer science, right? This is the law, this is social science for many, many years of statistics before, all this, before algorithms were even invented, as far as I can tell. And so I think it's important for us to not reify this wrong way of thinking and talking about it by talking about something like, well, no, just the effect of sex, just the direct effect, right? Like if you take my view, once you pull out all of the indirect effects, all you have is a biological view of the category left. That's all that's left in the little node. Once you pulled out preferences, affect, way of being treat, right? Like that's all that's left. And so part of it, I think that we really do need to change the way that we're talking and not talk about something like just the effect of sex, the direct effect of race. And again, like this is a major problem in the law too. And it's the more that we talk like that the law accepts that, the narrower the ambits of anti-discrimination law and equal protection are. So I think one is that, and the other is, and then just once you think very carefully about that, we're gonna say it differently, and then you're just gonna be very explicit about what the normative questions are. You're gonna be very explicit by saying, look, it looks like in this world there's systematic differences in non-repayment, not just because of wealth, but because of access to kinship networks. And once we describe that and see that, then we can put, I think, the normative debates in much more clear terms, as opposed to having it hide behind this false veiled side of like metaphysics or scientism, like, oh, this is fair because I've isolated the causal effect of race. Like, no, you haven't. All you've said is that given that race makes people different in this way, this is a fair way of treating people, and this is a fair way to, and then it's just more clear what kinds of debates we're having.
Yeah, that's great. So just as a quick note, we have just a few minutes left. And I feel like we've been ramping up, and I'd love for us to find a way to sort of ramp down. And I'd love to hear from each of you. I mean, obviously this is a really engaging debate, and I don't think that you all are the only ones that are thinking about these things, and I think having these kinds of conversations. So I'd love to hear from you, just sort of thinking to the future. Sort of, what do you think the key aspect of this debate, in the context of fact, people should be thinking about and talking about as these conversations move forward? And we can start. Can we start with you, Ricardo?
Yeah. So just to wrap things up, first, I'm very happy to be here having this debate. We cover different aspects here, and one of these aspects is related to which kind of measurements should be allowed to include, or should feel sensible to include in a decision problem. But one thing that we didn't cover here at all, which maybe just good to mention this couple of minutes, is questions like representativeness, that you may be able to know something about, for example, the effect of COVID among white middle-aged people, and not know much about the effect on minorities. And this is an artifact of the fact that many randomized controlled trials, they try to make very specific control subgroups of people where you're evaluating your treatments. And going that, one challenge that I pose to the community effect is try to understand, okay, if representativeness is a problem in other issues like image classification or in other practical applications of machine learning, it's also a problem in even randomized controlled trials. So if you want to understand a bit better about treatments among minorities, this is kind of one logical consequence of all this idea of personalizing treatments, or personalized medicine, or other ways by which you can try to customize a treatment for an individual. But I think there's still not much done in that area that tries to take into account the actual issues of fairness and representativeness. People sometimes talk about personalized medicine in a very general way, or policy making in a very general way. But I think now is a good opportunity to be able to look into, okay, let's drop this idea that are doing randomized trials just for middle-aged white men. Let's see what actually happens to other subgroups, and let's have actually real impact in the world by looking at these particular questions, also in the representativeness in trials, in observational studies, and so on. Okay, so it's a bit unrelated to what we discussed before, but
Yeah, that's
I
great.
just like to wrap this
No,
up
no,
with
no, no,
this
no. But I think
message.
it's great. This conversation, no, this conversation is by no means over. So I think that's fantastic. And Koski and Isa, you have about 1.5 minutes between the two of you. So Koski, you go first, and then Isa, you round us out.
Okay, yeah, well, thanks for having me be part of this panel. It's very exciting. I think from my point of view and more practical point of view, I think there's a lot of work can be done to assess the interaction between the algorithms and humans, how the algorithmic recommendations affecting the human decisions, interaction between the two. I think that's really interesting in a society where, you know, algorithms are basically everywhere. And then I guess we just have to keep in mind that whatever you're studying or working on is just a small part of the big social institution. And that perspective, I guess, is, you know, it's very important to keep everything in perspective and look for the potential issues and problems. So I'll just stop there.
Great, thank you. And Isa, you got like 30 seconds, but I feel like you have.
That's great.
made your
I've said a
case.
lot.
Yeah.
I just want to say thank you
think
so much
people-
for having me be part of this. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody. This is a fantastic panel, and I feel like this is exactly the kind of debate we wanted to have. So thanks for the friendly sparring. For everyone watching, if you're sticking around for the keynote, you need to refresh this live stream for that keynote to come up, which is starting in 1 minute. And thanks everybody for joining and for the questions in Slido. I really enjoyed it. So see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.